The Nigerian Upstream Petroleum and Regulatory Commission has revealed the federal government's plan to revoke unused oil exploration leases that companies were granted but have not been able to carry out any exploration activities on them. Latest data from the NUPRC shows that about 53 exploration leases were issued from 2003 till date, but over 60% of the prospecting licenses issued to local and foreign oil firms had expired. The Chief Executive Officer of the NUPRC, Mr. Gbenga Komolafe, said the Commission will initiate reviews of these leases, and awards of the leases would be subject to specific terms and conditions. Mr. Komolafe has stated that only companies with viable technical and financial backup would get to keep their leases. Well, let's get talking now. The proposed budget for 2024's fiscal year has continued to generate conversation, controversies, comments among experts and business community and members of the business community, of course. Recall President Bola Tinubu presented the proposed 2024 budget estimated to the joint session of the National Assembly last week, describing it as a budget of renewed hope. Estimates of 27.5 trillion naira. That is more than the $32 billion, which with an oil price assumption of $77 and an assumed currency value of 750 naira per dollar. The president says his administration is targeting 3.75% economic growth for next year, with an inflation target of 21.4% for 2024. For more perspective on this, I'm being joined by Mr. Olumide Esan. He is a partner and industry leader, energy and resources with Deloitte West Africa. Mr. Esan, good afternoon and thank you so much. It's really good to see you.
Good afternoon, Tolulope. It's great to be on your show again. Good afternoon, viewers.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start with the assumptions. For me, I think I would like to take it up from there, because those are also places where we could expect revenue to come in from government, crude oil prices, looking at the production quota, what is expected. Some say this looks too ambitious. What do you make of it?
Well, so as you already mentioned, maybe starting with the assumptions, 1.78 million barrels per day. Given where we are today, where we're currently doing about 1.5 million barrels, it's ambitious but not impossible. OPEC did come back and say that they projected, 1.5 million barrels a day. And if you consider that the OPEC projection excludes condensates, so it appears, the 1.78 is achievable. And there's been renewed effort on the part of government to arrest, the crude theft situation in the Niger Delta and, getting renewed commitments from the producers. So I think that it is achievable. 1.78 is a tall one, but I think governments can achieve it. And from a price perspective, 77.96 is not too aggressive. Given today we are on $85 per barrel. So depending on which side of the table you are, I think it's good to also set tall ambitions. But 1.78, well, I think it's achievable. But of course, on the assumption that government will sustain current war against crude theft, and also its renewed engagement of the stakeholders in the oil and gas industry. So that's what I would say about the assumption. And of course, we need to know that this is really very important. Unlike previous year, this year, the oil revenue constitutes about 43% of the entire projected revenue. Last year, oil revenue was projected at 20%. So of the 18.3 trillion we are expecting in revenue in 2024, we expect a significant part of it to coming from the oil industry. So, and that is why it's important to constantly have conversation around how realistic are these projects.
We expect the fiscal committee, that's the Taiwo Oyedele-led committee, to also help government at least get some money from that end, taxation and all of that. And we are looking at the FRS trying to also generate, expanding the tax net and all of that. But I'm looking at how much this can help us bridge this revenue challenge in reality.
Well, as you know, the Tariff Delays Committee has got ongoing work. But I think at the end it would add up. The expectation is that it will make our tax system simpler, and yet ensure that those who are outside the net are brought into the net. So I trust that the committee will do a good job. But again, looking at the breakdown of the revenue for this year, for 2024, 8 trillion is expected from oil. 3.5 from non-oil sources and 7 trillion from others. I think that it's well balanced. If we assume that the assumptions we discussed earlier about oil holds true, then you've solved part of the problem, and then we can then focus on how do we ensure that the peaks from the non-oil source and other income are realized. I think that's always where the conversation needs to be. Already we're running at a projected deficit which is about a third of the entire budget. So at 9.2 trillion, that's a third of the entire projected 27.5 trillion of in terms of deficit. So I think it's an ambitious one, but there's a lot of good things coming out of this budget. For example, I can say that targeting a 3.88% of GDP as deficit is a good improvement, bearing in mind that the Fiscal Responsibility Act provides for only 3%. So 3.88 is a slight improvement from last year in terms of what the deficit number will look like. I mean, if you look at it in itself, 9.2 trillion as deficit is huge because it's about 50% of the entire revenue projected for this year. But if you look at it as a function of the GDP, maybe it's somehow manageable. I think the other highlight for me is the fact that unlike the 2023 budget, the revenue in this year's budget is 66% higher than what we had last year in terms of projected revenue. What we had, at this time last year, we projected for 2023. So it's an improvement from a revenue point of view, and that is why the deficit has also gone down, as a percentage of GDP. So there will be, challenges along the way, but I think if you look at it, I think I looked at the expenditure profiles, for example. I see the budget itself is just a modest increase over last year, just 11% thereabouts, year-on-year increase, which is quite modest, versus the revenue, which has increased, by 66% from what it was last year. So I think we need to call out these good stuffs, and where we see challenges, we also call out the challenges. For example, the issue around the debt service, at 8.5 trillion budgeted for debt service, that's roughly about 29-30% increase on the debt service for last year. That is huge, but again, it is what it is. It's huge in terms of absolute time, and even in percentage terms, that debt service alone will go up, about 46% of our projected revenue. That's debt service and sinking fund. So there are areas, of potential challenges, but there are also the good sides of this budget to be called out.
I agree with you, Mr. Olumide, because I was looking at the debt service aspect of it, and you already touched on it. I was already going there because that is huge. Looking at what we have at the moment, inflation is targeted to taper down, let's say to about 21.4%. That's what government is projecting for next year. Yeah. We're at about 27.3% as we speak, and many will tell you that it doesn't look like we are going to get to that point moving further, considering the conditions we face at the moment. Subsidy is gone, and we know what that is: price hike, purchasing power, and all of that. So CBN says we'll do inflation targeting That was what the CBN governor said the last time he met with the business community. In all of this, what do you make of inflation figures moving forward in real terms?
Yeah, so I mean, from where I see it, I see inflation, peaking this December, right? As the government is new and they're trying to get their acts together, I expect that by Q1 of 2024, we'll start to see a joined up, policy instruments being rolled out. We all know that part of the reason why we have this high inflation is also because we have significant instability in food producing areas, and the food basket forms a significant part of inflation, measures. So, if we're able to, arrest issues around insecurity in areas mainly where food is produced in the Middle Belt, and we're able to deal with other infrastructural issues, particularly issues around the midstream of the agro-allied industry, which is about storage. If that will help us to arrest, food inflation. Transportation is a huge part of it. We know that the government is working around, this idea of CNG buses, and when it will come into play, this should all, force down, inflation, because we know that, when transport is high, food costs are high, and other aspects of inflation get impacted by the sheer cost of transportation. So if government indeed is working around this transportation bit, they're able to fix the midstream agro-allied industry, which is primarily about infrastructure and storage, and they're able to stabilize, the food producing regions, of insecurity and all that. I think that indeed it could be possible that can bring down inflation. And this is excluding what you mentioned earlier about targeted or inflation busting monetary policies to be rolled out by the central bank.
Interestingly, many would say that handshake is very important at this time. I know you would agree with me that it is important to have that handshake. That's between the fiscal and the monetary side. But let's look at some sectoral prioritization in this budget, how it's being shaped. Health, defense, education. I think they are topping. They're top on that list. What do you make of that? And the budget is to reduce deficit and increase capital spending. Well, we've talked about that earlier too, but keenly, what do you make of the sectoral distribution for we move forward?
Yeah, so I agree with the health, education, and the defense bit, because they speak to the pressing areas of the economy. When we talk about human capital, indices, we also are looking at this sort of measures that track how we're doing in terms of our investment in human capital. So, investing more in healthcare, investing more in education are really so critical. And when we talk about the defense, it covers, security as well. So I think they are rightly prioritized. Now, talking about the, infrastructure, and that's essentially, capital expenditure.
Yeah.
We have just under 8 trillion budgeted for that, and that was the same amount or thereabout that we budgeted in 2023 budget. I think for me, that's a good number. I think the challenge I have is the performance. As of September ending, we've only allocated about 1.5 trillion to capital expenditure out of the 8 trillion. My math tells me that's just about 20% performance. So, the concern I have is, how do we ensure that we don't find ourselves in this space again, when we start to implement the 2024 budget? 8 trillion, if it is well spent, we will feel the impact. But looking at, history, if for 2023 right now, as of September, like I said, only 20% has been disbursed, then it could be a challenge if we can't, implement the budget. Of course, recurrent expenditure still tops at 9.9 trillion. That's almost 10 trillion of the 27.5 trillion recurrent expenditure basically will go to overheads and salaries and all that. So I think until we also start to revisit the cost of governance, we may be unable to do much around recurrent expenditure because people who are currently in employment must be paid, really. So maybe when we start to revisit the issue of the cost of governance, then we start to see opportunity of, maybe structuring, merging some ministries, as proposed in the Orosanye report, which was never really implemented. So for me, I think given that what we had overall, the 27.5 is just 11% increase over last year, and we practically, left the capital expenditure at 8 trillion, or just under it, whilst at the same time, we have an increased debt service burden of almost 30%. I think there's a good balance between, capital expenditure and recurrent expenditure and debt service.
Let's talk about implementation of our budget and our system over time. Many will say the timing seems to be good. Now we follow the right budget cycle, January, December, to help the things work as planned. But what would you say about previous implementations and what you see moving forward?
So, I mean, I agree on the need to align with January to December calendar years. I think the challenge has always been that, this whole budget process starts too late in the year, and then it puts pressure on the legislature, and they are not as thorough as Nigerians would have loved them to be in calling out and reviewing the budget for the MDAs. But having said that, we must also realize that whenever you have a new government in place, there's always a first time, and so they may struggle to get this together on time. And as a matter of fact, I think they're even still a month earlier than when we had a similar transition in 2015. Now, in terms of the expenditure itself, I criticized earlier that this year we've only been able to do 20% as of September of the capital expenditure. But you see, that is also a function of fund. It's a function of revenue. And as you know, when there is a conflict, you probably just, first of all, deal with the current expenditure because that's where salary is. So you can't be building road when you have not paid salaries. So if we can achieve our revenue target and got the other sources of funds, then we may be better off this year in terms of budget performance.
A good way to live it. And we'll follow up and see how it plays. And moving on, I must thank you so much, Mr. Olumide Esan. He's a partner and industry leader, energy and resources, dealing with West Africa. Do enjoy the rest of your day. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, coming up on the show, we'll look at challenges and prospects for the manufacturing sector. Yes, it's the Yuletide season, but how well are you buying at this time, considering prices and all of that? We'll have the Managing Director and CEO of Dignity Finance and Investment Limited,